Dear guests, now I would like to introduce Professor Dr. Cyril Hoverun as the keynote speaker of our Dies Facultatis. As I mentioned already, the fact that we have invited him has not least to do with the fact that since the outbreak of the war, we have had a strongly committed group at the faculty which has devoted a great deal of attention both to the topics surrounding this war and contacts with Ukrainian researchers. At the faculty, where both Orthodox theology and Eastern Church studies are represented, and where Ukrainian researchers also works, this suggests itself. The Russian Federation's war of aggression against Ukraine has drawn a lot of public and academic attention to Ukraine. One wants to be able to understand and classify the phenomenon of this war. The role of the Church, especially theological narratives and sermons of the Russian Patriarchate, show great influence. Backgrounds and interpretations we want to pursue now with the renowned Ukrainian theologian Cyril Hoverun. Cyril Hoverun is a professor of ecclesiology, international relations and ecumenism at St. Ignatius College, University College Stockholm, and the director of the Huffington Ecumenical Institute at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles. As graduate of the Theological Academy in Kiev and National University in Athens, he accomplished his doctoral studies at Durham University. The topic of his thesis was related to the post-Chalcedonian Christology. In addition to his international career as a scientist, he was also heavily involved in church committees in leading positions. He was a chairman of the Department for External Church Relations of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and first deputy chairman of the Educational Committee of the Russian Orthodox Church. He was also a research fellow at Yale and Columbia Universities and also a visiting professor at the University of Münster in Germany. He is an international fellow at Chester Ronning Center for the Study of Religion and Public Life at the University of Alberta in Canada and an invited professor at the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome. More than 500 pieces of his research and journalism have been published in 30 languages. For years, in his lectures and publications, he has criticized the ideology of the Russian world, which ultimately led to the war in Ukraine. This criticism also includes the Russian Orthodox Church, whose influence, in his opinion, should not be underestimated. This criticism eventually led to his suspension from his priesthood as Russian Orthodox priest at the end of September. We are pleased that we could win him for the keynote speech at our Dies Facultatis. Dear Mr. Hoverun, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It is a true honor and pleasure to be here in Vienna at this faculty. And let me begin with thanking you. I'd like to thank you personally and institutionally for what I know you are doing for Ukraine. And I know that many of you are involved in different charities, in different efforts, international efforts to help the Ukrainians in Ukraine and the Ukrainians in Austria. My personal friends from Kyiv were hosted by families in Austria. And they told me how hospitable were the people who never knew them, and they received them as their own families. It was really touching, and we cannot find words to express our gratitude. Thank you so much on behalf of the Ukrainians. I should also say that I don't like what I'm doing right now. I prefer to study beautiful ideas, theological ideas, to study patristic texts, to study theology of the church, about the church. It has its beauty, it has its harmony, and unfortunately what I have to do this time is to study distorted ideas. I have to do deconstructive work more than I have to do what I like, constructive work. And that's what I'm going to do today, unfortunately. So bear with me with my deconstructive work, as I'm going to discuss the ideas that I believe have led to this war. Because in my opinion, this war has a very simple formula: guns plus ideas, or rather ideas plus guns, in this order. It started with ideas. It continues with ideas. It rides on ideas. And this war will end only with the end of the ideas that had led to it. Those ideas have some theological underpinnings and origins. And I think I'm addressing a very, very well-prepared audience who know theology, you know those ideas. And I'm going to explore what kind of distortion, what kind of abuse have led to the formation of the ideology that underpins this war in Ukraine. A muddy torrent of quasi-theological apocrypha, dicta, narratives, sermons, etc., contributes to what the Russians apply as the euphemism special military operation in Ukraine, in quotation marks always. It is being poured out from the quills and lips of senior Orthodox hierarchs, including the Russian Patriarch himself, and smaller figures constituting an ecosystem within and around the Moscow Patriarchate. I'm speaking about really an ecosystem, theological ecosystem within the church that propels the war. And it includes priests, lay theologians, and activists. This torrent is quite sizable and powerful enough to rotate the millstones of the war. Indeed, in my judgment, at least, the machina of the Russian war has its own deus, hence is the title of my presentation, Deus Ex Machina. This Deus Ex Machina is quasi-orthodox, quasi-theology. It helps rationalizing the raison d'être of the special military operation. It is, if it is at all rationalizable, this war. The rationalization is really the thing that the theologians in Russia struggles with. They try to rationalize this war, and that is their main job, their main contribution to this war. They try to make it rational for the Russian population. Without at least a rudimentary rationalization, the operation does not make any sense to an even average Russian lowbrow Philistine. The mentioned quasi-theology provides such a rudimentary rationalization. It has also become a popular and indeed a populist ideology of sorts. I would call it a populist theology. When zoomed out, it substitutes the Soviet ideology, which was based, by the way, on the denial of religion. So it's like a mirrored image of the Soviet ideology, what they have produced, with the only difference that from radical atheism they moved to radical orthodoxism. When zoomed in, it tries to explain, for example, why the Russian mothers should be thankful to the state for their sons having become cannon fodder thousands of kilometers away. If we take, for example, the Soviet war in Afghanistan, invasion to Afghanistan in 1979, 1989, and at this moment I think I may click. Yeah. This is a portrait of a Soviet mother holding a portrait of her killed son in the Afghanistan invasion. And if we take this war in Afghanistan and the ongoing war in Ukraine, however different their rationales and methods might be, for most Russians they are very remote and not related to their personal lives. So you see the portrait of a Soviet mother holding a portrait of her son. And here you can see another picture. It was taken in Blagoveshchensk. It's far, far away in Russia, in the Far East. And it says, dads are supposed to protect, you are needed there. So it's like a military placate, a military incitement for the Russians to draw for the army. Ideologies mobilize masses and make them ready to sacrifice for the sake of remote wars. This is one of many differences between the Russians and the Ukrainians in the context of the war. The Ukrainians do not need any ideology to fight this war, because it has come to almost every Ukrainian home in the most immediate way. There is an ideology in Ukraine that moves us to the war. In other words, we Ukrainians, we do not need Deus to be present in the machina of the war. In contrast to us, most Russians desperately need such a Deus. And I write it with small d, of course, because it's one of those gods of war that the Russians invoke. And the Russian Orthodox Church provides them with such a Deus. After the fiasco of the Soviet ideology, the Russian Church re-emerged from the margins of the post-Soviet public square and occupied its center. Its ambition was to give a homo post-Sovieticus a completely new raison d'être. This ambition ended up in providing a new raison de mourir in the war. During the post-Soviet transition, what promised to be a theology of life turned to the ideology of death. Such an ideology was intended for mass consumption by ordinary people. However, even its demiurgs seem to have a desperate ananke, the Greek term for need, to consume what they produce. They intended to gaslight masses, but eventually became victims of their own manipulations. In result, even Vladimir Putin does not seem to be able to explain this war to himself without the narratives produced by his counterparts in the church. The church wanted to be just useful to his regime by offering theologized ideologies or ideologized theologies. Instead, it became indispensable in selling the war to both the Russian peoples and elites. Since his boringly verbose February 2022 sermons on the Russian TV about the reasons of the war delivered on the Russian TV, the only permanent thing about his rationalizations of the war has been that they permanently changed. So Putin tried to explain the war all the time, has tried since February 2022, and his narratives changed all the time. Very liquid narratives. The more Putin tries to explain the war publicly, the less convincing he sounds. One has an impression that he really struggles to explain the war to himself. The more he struggles, the more metaphysical or quasi-theological his arguments turn. These arguments are like Ovid's metamorphoses. They change with a dizzying kaleidoscopicity, but there is always a deity underneath them. And this deity is usually not compassionate with the human beings. They are really like the ancient Greek gods. up there on the Olympus, no compassion to the human beings. Even before he waged his war against Ukraine in 2014, Putin had adopted quite a few lexems coined by the church. They originated from the limbo, which is between the sacred and profane narratives. One of them is the lexem of the traditional values. This lexem is an elaboration on the concept of values, which was designed by the sociologist of religion and just sociologist in the 1970s as a vehicle to smuggle some religious ideas through the well-guarded walls of secularism. In the 2000s, which some, such as Jürgen Habermas, perceive as an era when post-secularity replaced secularism, this concept effectively became an alternative to liberal democracy. With this new rationale, it was appropriated by the emerging autocracies in China, Russia, Hungary, and elsewhere across the globe. In 2022, Putin made traditional values a law in Russia. The law is called on the approval of the fundamentals of state policy regarding the preservation and strengthening of traditional Russian spiritual and moral values. Imagine the title of a law. And this was signed by the Russian president on November 9th, 2022. Putin did not stop at half measures. In exploiting theological languages, he advanced to a fully fledged biblical and theological hermeneutics. In its spirit, while addressing a crowd at the Luzhniki Stadium in Moscow in February 2023, he drew a parallel between the Russian word Отечество, which is best rendered by the German Der Vaterland, and the Lord's Prayer. And I quote him, "In this phrase, in these words, there is something powerful, huge, I would even say mystical and holy. No wonder, therefore, that one of the most famous prayers begins with the words, Our Father." And I'm going to show you this piece. Well, what I will show you can be embarrassing to some, and I apologize for that. But this is how the Russian propaganda works, and that's how theology works as a deus ex machina within this propaganda.
Президент Российской Федерации Владимир Владимирович Путин.
That's when he explained the Lord's Prayer to the crowds in Luzhniki.
Мы встречаемся с вами в преддверии Дня защитника Отечества. В этом словосочетании, в этих
I just
словах
quoted
есть
him,
что-то
and this is the
мощное,
original
огромное.
quote.
Я бы сказал, мистическое и святое. Недаром одна из самых известных молитв начинается со слов «Отче наш», «Отче», «Отец». И в этом есть что-то очень близкое каждому человеку.
In the same meeting on the stadium, there was like a concert, and there was a performance by the singer. His nickname is Shaman, and he tried to articulate the same ideology in a song. The inscription on his t-shirt is "I am a Russian."
Встанем, пока еще с вами мы живы, и правда за нами.
You see the icons, so they use a lot of attributes, icons.
Сверху на нас кто-то смотрит родными глазами. Они улыбались, как дети, и в небо шагали. Встанем и ближе к ним станем.
This is a video clip with the same singer. It's quite telling. You will see why. It has subtitles now. God is with us. Well, he uses the keywords blood, will, soil, keywords of Nazism. I could not resist the temptation of drawing a parallel with another episode that will follow. You will see it.
The stag in the forest runs free, but gather together to greet the storm. Tomorrow
They look very similar, don't they?
belongs to me. The branch of the linden is leafy and green. The Rhine gives its gold to the sea, but somewhere a glory awaits unseen. Tomorrow belongs to me. Oh, fatherland, fatherland, show us a sign. Your children are waiting to see. The morning will come when the world is mine. Tomorrow belongs, tomorrow belongs, tomorrow.
And this crowd singing has a clear parallel to the last episode in this video clip. You will see. I believe this is self-explanatory. I don't need to explain this. In the same spirit of theological hermeneutics, the Russian president from 2008 through 2012, Dmitry Medvedev, is even more theologizing than Putin. In trying to rationalize the war, he seems to particularly like referring to demonology. Thus, he published on the social network popular in Russia, Telegram, the following. I quote him. "We have the ability to send all enemies to the fiery Gehenna." Here, Medvedev apparently implies using nuclear weapons. But this is not our task. We listen to the words of the Creator in our hearts and we obey them. These words give us a sacred, he uses sacred purpose. The goal is to stop the supreme Lord of hell, whatever name he has, Satan, Lucifer, or Iblis. End of quote. In the Muslim demonology, as you know, Iblis is a chief of demons. In Medvedev's imagination, he is also the chief of the Western powers. Speaking of which, in another post on his Telegram channel, Medvedev refers to his former European colleagues in the positions of political leadership as, I quote, entirely miserable amateurs, tarry Russophobes, and intellectual pygmies. So that's how he addresses his other presidents and prime ministers in Europe. Russophobia is a key word here and in zillions other messages emitted by the Russian propaganda. The real driving force of Russophobia for many Russians is hatred to Orthodox Christianity. Their logic is the following. Orthodoxy is the only true religion. Satan, who lurks in all Western political institutions and churches, hates truth and therefore orthodoxy. He moves the West to attack Russia. But his ultimate goal is to destroy orthodoxy. Most Western politicians, therefore, without necessarily realizing this, serve the Satan. Either consciously or unconsciously, they execute his will. Russophobia, therefore, is something like a Western original sin. In the words of an Orthodox lay activist of some fame, Kirill Frolov, I quote him, pacifism and Russophobia are sins against the Orthodox teaching. End of quote. In tune with Frolov, a professor of the Moscow Theological Academy, Archpriest Vladislav Tsipin, in his recent article, The Special Military Operation in the Light of the Christian Teaching on War and Peace, that is his title, mentions the saying attributed to the former United States National Security Advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski. I quote, after the defeat of the USSR in the Cold War, the main enemy of the free world became the Orthodox Church, together with other traditional religions that have not embarked on the path of modernist liberalization and all the adherents of traditional moral values, end of quote. It has been proven that this statement by Brzezinski is a fake, but this does not matter to the Russian propagandists who keep quoting him. As for the real statements by American politicians regarding Russia, I cannot resist referring to the debates between Barack Obama and Mitt Romney during the presidential campaign in 2012, when they famously diverged on how to assess Putin's Russia. For Romney, Putin's regime was as early as in 2012 America's #1 geopolitical foe. For Obama, in contrast, Russia was a mere regional power, which was better to ignore. Well, it appears the latter assessment proved to be wrong in many senses, including how the Russians themselves perceive their antagonism with the West. This antagonism, in their imagination, has the scale of a cosmic battle, eschatological. Patriarch Kirill is particularly eloquent in painting such a picture with thick brush strokes. According to him, God himself endorsed Russia with a special mission to save the world from itself. And I quote the Patriarch, "The Lord has chosen our country and our church, not because of our personal holiness or our good deeds, which we do not have, but because of the prayers of our saints, martyrs, and confessors, because of the great civilizational work that Russia had done by establishing orthodoxy across the spaces of the Eurasian continent. So we must firmly follow what the Lord intends us to do by holding our country, our people, and through this, perhaps, the entire world from the domination of the devil, from decay and destruction." End of quote. In this passage, the Patriarch refers to the Pauline concept of katechon. The second epistle to the Thessalonians implies something that Paul had more explicitly explained to the community in Salonika, and what the epistle's modern readers can only guess. I will not quote it. It's the epistle to Thessalonians, second epistle, chapter 2, verses 5 to 12. Paul is writing here about what has already happened, and he uses the verb idate, you have seen what has happened. What is happening, he uses the word energite, is acted. And what will happen, apokalyptisete, will be revealed. So Paul uses three tenses, the past, present, and future, in the passage when he explains the katechon, what is the katechon. He also refers to the katechon as both a thing, he uses the word to katechon in Greek, and a person, o katechon. Both are supposed to withhold, that is the old King James translation, withhold, or restrain, this is the new King James translation, the lawlessness, which is also implied to both a thing and a person. This passage is obscure enough to allow a wide array of interpretations, usually addressing and serving various political agendas. In what we know as Byzantium, it endorses the Basilevses with an extra layer of legitimacy. They were believed to be an ensouled or alive soul. The phrase for that is empsychos nomos or lex animata, as it was stated, for example, in Emperor Justinian's Novella Constitutionis, and I quote Justinian and his novella. However, the emperor is fortunately removed from all those things we have just mentioned, as God himself elevated him above the laws, sending him down to be a living law, nomon avtin empsychon, and a living law amongst men. For this reason, the consulate belongs in perpetuity to the emperor over all cities, peoples, and nations, to govern them in his person and according to his pleasure, or through another, conferring the consular robe on him, for the consular office always goes along with the imperial scepter. End of quote. The source for this novella, so again, this is a novella that states that the emperor is exempted from the law, almost in actually Carl Schmitt's sense of exemption from law. So it goes back to Justinian. But Justinian is not the author of this concept. It goes back to some pagan thinkers. It builds on the ideas that go back to the Hellenistic times, when, for example, Pseudo-Architas of Tarentum, it's Taranto. I've just been to this beautiful Italian city which used to be Greek, Taranto or Taras Greek. So this Architas lived there, and he lived sometime between the 1st century BC and 3rd century AD, and he differentiated between two kinds of law. The soulless one, codified in letters, apsychos gramma, and the ensouled one, embodied in the person of a king. I quote him, nomon de omen empsychos Vasilevs. So two kinds of law. One is embodied in the letters, and another one embodied in the souls. This idea was imported to the Christian political theology by a prominent pagan statesman who served several Christian emperors, Themistius. He died circa 388. He explained, let me quote him. Now I came back to my beloved patristic stuff from all this Russian nonsense. So, Themistius, do you want to know what is philosophy's contribution? It declares that the king is living law, nomon empsychon in efficin non Basilea, a divine law which, in the course of time, has come down from above, nomon theon anothen ikonda en chrono, as outpouring of the eternal good, a providence of that nature closer to the earth, who looks in every way towards him and strives in every way for imitation, who is absolutely divinely born and divinely nourished, as Homer says, sharing with God these other epithets too, guardian of guests, guardian of suppliants, the kindly one, the bringer of fruits, the giver of good things, orchestrator of justice, steward of ease, overseer of good fortune. End of quote. This pagan idea of king as an ensouled law framed the Byzantine hermeneutics of Paul's idea of katechon. Paul, as we have seen, presented the katechon as both a thing and a person. I found it really a striking parallel between how the law was presented by people like Themistius as a thing and a person, and Paul presents a katechon as a thing and a person. The Byzantine political theologians applied both notions to the emperor, meaning the notion of empsychos nomos, the ensouled law, and a katechon. Both the institution and the personality of an emperor became the embodiments of the scriptural katechon in the eyes of many Byzantines. Putin's political theologians apply this idea to the contemporary political desiderata. For them, katechon is still both a person and an institution. Putin is the person. However, unlike in Byzantium, the institution is not the presidential office as a continuation of the imperial office, but Russia itself. So that is the transformation from Byzantium to Russia. In Byzantium, it was the institution, the imperial institution, which was to katechon, while the Basilevs was o katechon. In Russia, Putin is o katechon, and Russia itself is to katechon. I lost it. Yeah, here we go. One of the faithful Putin's lieutenants, Vyacheslav Volodin, presently the chairman of the State Duma of the Russian Federation, famously stated in 2014, "If there is Putin, there is Russia. If there is no Putin, there is no Russia." That's something that we in Ukraine hope for. No wonder, therefore, that any critique of Putin is interpreted by his adherents as symptoms of Russophobia. As we have seen, Professor Father Tsipin mentioned Byzantinophobia as related to Russophobia. I believe there are reasons to be afraid of Byzantium, and I agree with this. However, not Byzantium per se, as Father Tsipin implies, but the political instrumentalization of the idea of Byzantium, that is to say, Byzantinism. As a matter of fact, all right-wing dictatorships that existed in the countries with the Orthodox tradition during the 20th century made references to Byzantium and pretended to reincarnate the latter. Putin Russia does the same. The idea of katechon is one of many similar ideas from the nomenclature of the Byzantine political theology. As a rule, the original ideas are quite modified and adjusted to the current political circumstances. One of Putin's most prominent political theologians, Metropolitan Tikhon Shevkunov, who was just recently appointed to Crimea as a new kind of satrap of Crimea, has made a particular contribution to boosting the legitimacy of Putin's regime by referring to Byzantium. Shevkunov's Byzantium is a fantasy, very different from the original Eastern Roman Empire as it used to exist. Tikhon has constructed a Byzantium that fits Putin's fantasy about Russia in a seminal movie that he produced in 2007. This is a Byzantium hated by the West, and this hatred is extrapolated upon Russia. Let me show a small piece, a short piece of this movie that explains a lot the current Putin's regime. Here we go.
The fall of an empire, the lesson of Byzantium. The West's vengeful hatred of Byzantium and her successors is entirely inexplicable to the West itself. It goes to some deep genetic level, and, as paradoxically as this may seem, continues even to the present day. Without an understanding of this amazing but undeniable fact, we risk misunderstanding not only distant history, but even historical events of the 20th and 21st centuries.
It's some difficulty to explain. Anyways, this is like an imagined Byzantium that they use as a model in order to create a completely imagined Russia. So we are dealing with two phantasms, effectively. Alexander Dugin concurs with Tikhon Shevkunov in assuming that Putin's Russia embodies Byzantium's religious, soteriological, and eschatological mission, I quote him. At the center of this mission, Dugin believes there is the supreme ruler as a paternal, almost mystical figure, I use his words. He argues that, I quote, within the advent of Putin, And by virtue of his truly decisive patriotic reforms, the autocratic principle unfolded in full force. The Russian people want only Putin and no one else, and for this, they are ready to change the constitution and everything else. Putin is the supreme ruler, the savior of Russia. End of quote from Dugin. One of the most important references to Byzantium that implied Putin's role as a new Basilevs was his visit to Mount Athos in Greece in 2016. This monastic commonwealth reached its prominence in the Middle Ages owing to the endorsements from the Byzantine Basilevses, who in exchange sought from the monks blessings and endorsement for their rule. Essentially, Mount Athos grew as in a huge factory of legitimacy for the Byzantine emperors, and continues to be, it seems, for some rulers nowadays. In our days, the Athonite monks were happy to endorse Vladimir Putin as a non-crowned king of the Orthodox realm, as in this episode. There are no theologians in modern Russia who would be of the caliber of Gerhard Kittel, Paul Althaus, or Emanuel Hirsch in Nazi Germany. Yet there are similarities between Hitler's and Putin's theologians. For example, both groups began as liberal theologians and ended as radical conservatives. Nazi theologians evolved from the liberal Protestant thought as it developed in the late 19th, early 20th century. Z theologians, as I call the supporters of Putin, grew from reading such open-minded Russian thinkers, mostly among the emigres, as Vladimir Lossky or George Florovsky. Everything that the West liked about Orthodoxy in the 20th century became distorted by the post-Soviet Russian theologians. At the same time, I believe the emigrant Orthodox theology was pregnant with some features of what would evolve to Z orthodoxy. One is the intrinsic anti-Westernism, and I would add anti-Catholicism, that, for example, derived the entire Western civilization from filioque, which is some nonsense, but it's a very popular point, that filioque became the basis for the entire Western civilization. There is a Greek theologian, very popular one, who claims that the economic crisis in Greece in 2008 was triggered by filioque, one of the most serious Greek theologians, actually. Let me illustrate how theological anti-Westernism became a path towards Z theology by the example of Professor Alexei Osipov. He is known internationally more than most other modern Russian theologians. For example, he represented the Moscow Patriarchate in the Orthodox Lutheran Ecumenical Dialogue, where I succeeded him, actually. He's also very popular among the faithful of the Russian Orthodox Church as a preacher and promoter of Orthodox spirituality. He counterposes it to the Catholic spirituality. In particular, he considers as spiritually dangerous and delusional such figures of the Catholic spirituality as Francis of Assisi and Teresa of Avila. Generally speaking, he has been quite anti-Catholic and proudly anti-Western since the Soviet era. After February 2022, Professor Osipov became a fervent proponent of Z orthodoxy. He explained, for example, and I quote him, that those steps that Russia has taken now, that is to say the war, are necessary. Thank God that it managed to launch the war at the last moment when everything was already hanging over the abyss, end of quote. He thus repeated the point of the Russian propaganda that Russia started its aggression preemptively, just before Ukraine would launch its attack on Russia being driven by the West. Osipov is a senior professor at the Moscow Theological Academy. This institution has become a center, a hotbed of Z theology. Similarly, for example, to what the Faculty of Theology at Jena University had become in Nazi Germany. A critical proportion of the Moscow Academy's faculty converted to Z orthodoxy. The former rector of the academy from 2019 through 2020, Bishop Peterim Tvorogov, now of Skopinsk and Shatsk, turned to one of the most outspoken preachers of the war against Ukraine. Here is only one piece of his pro-war preaching. After having visited the front line in Donbass, he shared with his congregation that he experienced there, I quote him, a special grace of God. In his words, he has not felt such a grace anywhere else, including Mount Athos or Jerusalem. He counterposed the criminals from the Wagner Group, which recently attempted, as you know, a coup d'etat, to those who criticized the war. For the ex-rector of the Theological Academy, the critics of the war are the true criminals, while the Wagner people are saints. Peterim believes that the Ukrainians are true Cains, while the Russians are Abels, not the other way around. The mentioned Father Vladislav Tsipin also presents the Ukrainians as as Cains. He thus brings up biblical arguments to corroborate his Z orthodoxy. Tsipin compares the Russian people with the Jews, whom Yahweh ordered to eliminate their enemies. And I quote, he quotes actually the Deuteronomy 20th chapter. Hear, Israel, today you are going into battle against your enemies. Do not faint-hearted. Do not be faint-hearted or afraid. Do not panic or be terrified by them. For the Lord your God is the one who goes with you to fight for you against your enemies to give you victory. So Tsipin refers to this one, this passage, when he explains the war. References to the war of Israel against its enemies have become an important part of the Russian Z theology, Z hermeneutics and propaganda. The Russian Orthodox Church-owned TV channel Spas broadcasted a piece of such propaganda through a documentary series called War and the Bible. It is based on the book by the Serbian bishop and Saint Nikolai Velimirovich with the same title, War and the Bible. Episode 5 from the series, titled For Which Reason Did God Condemn the Biblical Cities to Death?, focuses on the biblical story that told in the book of Joshua. Then you crossed the Jordan and came to Jericho. The citizens of Jericho fought against you, as did also the Amorites, Perizzites, and so forth. But I gave them into your hands. That is from Joshua. The episode with the reference to this point was recorded in Volnovakha, a Ukrainian city in the east of the country, occupied and almost completely demolished by the Russians. While standing against the backdrop of the destroyed city, one of the film's authors, Father Igor Fomin, who is actually the rector of the chapel in Gimo University, that is the main university for diplomatic service in Russia. And he's also a graduate of the Moscow Theological Academy. And he asserts, I quote him, that God gives a direct command to the Jewish people to cleanse their land from the peoples that were impious and therefore destined by God to go into oblivion, so that other peoples could be erected in their place. When asked the question, how can God, who loves mankind, want his people to perish, even if they are impious, Father Fomin answers, God does not think in the categories of human life. This is a liberal way of thinking. In contrast to it, God does not have limitations even when it takes to take the life of a whole people. He does not hesitate to eliminate the peoples when they apostatize from him. Although Father Fomin does not explicitly say that the same applies to the Ukrainian people, he implies it. While he is deliberating on this, the editors are showing footage from Ukraine, including the Revolution of Dignity in 2013-14. Their message is clear. The Ukrainians revolted against God when they turned against their president, Viktor Yanukovych, for which reason God sent the Russian army to punish them. I'll show you this episode.
Первая и главная причина любой войны – это нечестивая жизнь в мирное время, которая начинается тогда, когда человек
So exactly, they bring the point that during the revolution of dignity, the Ukrainian people deadly sinned.
Человека с Богом.
And for this reason,
Теперь в главе 7 приговоренных к смерти святитель вспоминает о 7 народах, населявших землю обетованную в пору, когда в нее пришли евреи, и о шокирующем повелении евреям от Господа вырезать эти народы. Со страшного признания начинает святитель Николай эту главу. Народ, если он отступает от единого и живого Бога, то он по существу становится мертвым, даже без войны. Он уже мертвец, народ. И его бытие в мире всем лишь дрожит и колышется, как тень, словно дерево, подпиленное под корень, но еще не поваленное. Кто-то услышит это, скажет, ну чего, ну как бы, ну это же народ, это же люди, Бог же всех любит. Все равно, как он может относиться
so he asks how God who loves people, how can he want to his people to die?
Как почти поваленному мертвому дереву.
Относится он к этому народу именно так, потому что Бог не мыслит категориями земной жизни. Он земную жизнь дает человеку для жизни вечной. И вот для Бога нету ограничений, нет ничего невозможного. И в свое время Он призывает народы, в свое время Он их и забирает к себе. В свое время Он дарует жизнь человеку, в свое время Он и забирает жизнь у человека.
Father Fomin asserts that the chosen people of Israel stopped to be chosen when they abandoned Christ. In a similar way, according to the film's narrative, the Ukrainians lost God's mercy after they chose to abandon the Russian world. They therefore deserve only destruction and ruin, which are demonstrated in the film in abundance. This message is really dangerous because it implies, for example, that God was behind the Shoah. It means that the Nazi army was an instrument of God's justice, as the Russian army is such an instrument in Ukraine. Therefore, there is no surprise why the Russian Z Orthodoxy is so much behind Hamas. I just, monitor, I read their publics. It's really striking. They are all for Hamas, and they all seem to hate Israel, for what they do. So the same people who bring those biblical arguments. These are only a few strikes of brush on the huge and quite horrifying canvas of Z theology. The question is, what is to be done to tackle it? I think nothing new should be invented as a remedy to what is nothing more but a variation of what Father Luigi Sturzo described as il clericofascismo and Dorothea Zolle as der Christofascismus. More classical forms of European fascism were deconstructed through an intellectual effort of philosophers and theologians, mostly in the West. Now we need to reapply creatively the approaches to the most recent form of fascism, which I believe calls itself the Russian world. I would like to use my presentation here as an invitation to all of you to accomplish this task together. Then we could contemplate together the sun prevailing over darkness. As in this picture, which I took in Father Sturzo's native Sicilian town of Caltagirone. So there is hope, there is light in the end, and I think we can bring it closer. And I believe that even our conversation here can bring closer the highly desired peace and justice to Europe. Thank you for your attention.